Hello, welcome back. Welcome to another video. I just recorded the first one, so no time has passed. I'm not wearing the same shirt as I did in the other video. I do laundry. I do leave my office. Don't worry about me. At least not yet. Anyway, in this video, I wanted to follow up on the first one. The first one was about how to do ethics in general. And a quick recap, I basically said modern ethics is done by drawing out our moral responses, examining them, seeing which ones are maybe unreliable, right? Like they're one-offs, they're freak accidents. Which ones are stable, which ones maybe are in tension with one another or contradict one another. And then looking at all those moral intuitions and trying to find, is there something they share, some core principle or value that's more general, that maybe is sitting in the back of my mind subconsciously and giving rise to these responses. And that's basically where ethical theories come in. Ethical theories are often attempts to make sense of all these moral intuitions, to try to find what they have in common or the general principles and values that we have. I'm trying not to sneeze directly into my mic. If I sneeze, I'm not restarting this video. I'm sorry. And no one's allowed to freeze frame it on my face and send it to me either. Automatic F if you do that. I'm just kidding. So yeah, that's basically what we discussed in the last one. And then we also discussed the idea of frameworks and how to use them in writing. And that's what we're going to get more into detail this time. So jumping right in, what is an ethical framework? Well, an ethical framework is really just, for the most part, it's really just an ethical theory. They're pretty much the same thing. Again, an ethical theory is trying to figure out, if not for the most fundamental, it's trying to get to fairly fundamental moral values and principles and rules that maybe the mind has, especially if they're universal or transcendent or objective. They're not just mere opinion, right? And again, we construct theories to make sense of our moral intuitions. Well, once we've constructed theories, right? Once we've constructed certain moral theories that we think, okay, this is really what we believe deep down, maybe not just as an individual, but a culture, then I'll skip over the part where we justify them or argue for the theories as being true. Let's just leave that aside. Let's say we've constructed a theory that basically says, okay, here's how to make sense of all my intuitions, all my moral responses to things. I value these certain things. I have these certain principles within me in the back of my mind subconsciously. And that's what's producing these intuitions. Now, I can then accept that theory and I basically say, okay, these are my deep down values, principles, convictions. Now I'm going to further apply those to situations that I didn't think of before. So now it's not just going from your intuitions to the theory. Now you've adopted your theory and you're relying on it, and your theory is further shaping your intuitions. You're now using your theory as a guide to solve further problems, to answer questions, or to know how to feel about something that you're not sure about. Does that make sense? So at first, again, we have intuitions. We don't really know why we have them. We just do. We try to construct theories about why we have this intuition. So we try to find some common values or more fundamental values and principles and rules. Once we have a theory we like, we adopt it, we believe it, and then we apply it, and it shapes future intuitions, right? It tells us how to act in future situations. It tells us what to care about and how highly or lowly, right? So there's this kind of back and forth give and take in ethics between intuitions and theories, but that's what theories do. Okay. Frameworks are basically theories that have been carefully developed and structured and well developed, that we can kind of use as a holistic way of looking at the world and making decisions, right? They can also be narrower than that. So you can have a big grand framework about what makes something right and wrong, what things we should all really care about universally. But then you can also have a theory about, well, this is how human beings feel about parenting. I have a theory about like values of parenting or values for the environment. And what really underlies those intuitions or reactions. I build a theory on it, and then that becomes entrenched, and then I adopt that theory in this one domain of parenting or environmental ethics, right? And then I have a narrower framework that I think of it as like a moral compass, a moral map to help you decide and find your way, or a pair of glasses you put on, and now you see the problem through those glasses, right? The glasses filter out certain things. They draw attention to other things to help you decide and see the relevant features. So you can have these grand theories, these grand frameworks that apply to everything. They're the most fundamental values, or they could be narrower in scope, like they just apply to parenting or the environment. But what they all have in common is that they're ways of seeing the world, they're ways of thinking, they're structured, developed ways of deciding, right? They help us choose what to do, what to care about, what to value, what principles to go with, right? And they're generally the best ones are structured and they're very well developed. Okay. So they do that by what I call sorry. They do that by what I call decision criteria. Frameworks are basically decision criteria. They tell us what are the relevant features to decide about. And let's just look at some examples here. So again, think about putting on a pair of glasses. If you put on a pair of glasses that have a blue tint, you're suddenly going to see the world in blue colors. And guess what? You're also going to see a little bit less, like red objects are going to stand out less to you than they did with just your natural eyes. And blue objects will be even more blue, so they'll be really intense. Think of ethical frameworks kind of like that. It's like a filter you're putting over your mental eyes that make certain things stand out, that make you care about or advise you to care more about certain features of things. And it's giving you a decision criteria because it's saying it's like a filter you're putting over your mind's eye that's saying, here's the things you look for. Here's the principles for how you make a decision. And here's the things you should care about the most. Some of them even give a ranking, right? But let's look at some examples because maybe that doesn't make sense talking abstractly. It's probably easier to understand this through looking at concrete examples. Okay, so here's some of the different frameworks that the book and the course go over. They call them different things. They cut them up in slightly different ways, but I'm going to give you a little bit more detail than the course modules do. So first things first, consequentialist framework. This is the most, I think the most intuitively plausible to modern people. But the consequentialist framework basically says, here's how you decide something. The only good way to decide what to do or what to care about is to kind of do a pro-con list. Calculate the consequences of the action. The only thing that matters for the consequentialist framework is the consequences of your action, hence why it's called consequentialism, right? You put on these glasses, the consequentialist glasses, and suddenly everything is filtered out except for the consequences of your action. If the action produces more good than evil, it's good. Pick the action that produces the most good and the least evil. There's a bunch of different types of consequentialism. There's a lot of different types of goods and evils. Different philosophers are going to agree what are good things, what are evil things, right? What are some examples? Some will say there's so many different kinds of good and evil things that we can't make an exhaustive list, right? Some will go the complete other way, though, and say there are so few good things and so few truly evil things that we can list them on one hand, and you should calculate those. So again, the consequentialist framework is a very broad way of thinking. It's basically the simplest decision criteria you could give. It's very straightforward. Does your decision maximize the good and minimize the evil? If not, it's wrong. If so, it's good and right, and that's the one you should pick. So you see how putting on those glasses, it gives you a decision criteria, it gives you a frame and a structure for how you approach an individual case study or thought experiment and what your opinion should be. So again, if I was looking at, here's how you apply it to your writing. If I was looking at one of the case studies in the book, yeah, I would reflect on and draw out my moral intuitions. I would try to figure out what is maybe the core value here that these intuitions have in common or are coming from or flowing out of. But then I would also ask, what would utilitarianism, or sorry, not utilitarianism, what would consequentialism say about this? And I look and I say, well, maybe my intuitions and my values don't line up with consequentialism then. And then it's the question of what's better, my moral values and principles that I have intuitively or consequentialism? And now I have to pick, right? Because they might lead you to different outcomes. They might lead you to make different decisions, or they might lead to the exact same decision, but for very different reasons, right? So in your writing, in your thinking in this class, you need to be drawing out your moral intuitions, trying to figure out what values and principles underlie them for you, but then also comparing and thinking through the lenses of these different frameworks. Okay, so there's consequentialism. Underneath consequentialism, as a very narrow kind of consequentialism or strict kind of consequentialism, is utilitarianism. It's consequentialist, so it's going to say, look, the only decision factor, the only decision criteria, maximize the good, minimize the evil. That's it. Do that. Anything else is bad. But they're strict or narrow in that they say, really, the only things that really truly are good or valuable in this life are pleasure, and the only thing that's really evil or disvaluable in this life is pain. So those are the two ultimate principles of morality and ethics for them. Decide what to do by calculating the amount of pleasure and pain produced by the action or the decision you have to make. The right action is the one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain, not just for you. That would be hedonism, not utilitarianism, but in the world overall. Consequentialism and utilitarianism aren't just about you. They're about the entire world. You're trying to, in everything you do, you're trying to maximize the good and minimize evil across the whole world, across the whole cosmos, really. All right? You're trying to have the best overall impact with your actions. And how do I put this? Utilitarianism says, I'm going to make it even simpler. The only things you think about are pleasure and pain. A consequentialist, someone like G.E. Moore, recognizes a bunch of different types of good and evil things. But the utilitarian only recognizes two. One good thing, pleasure, one evil thing, pain. So it's a really strict kind of consequentialism. So there's utilitarianism. Okay, the rights framework. This isn't so much an ethical theory as it's like it's hard. It's not an ethical theory. Utilitarians can believe in rights, and consequentialists can believe in rights, and so can other types of theorists, like a virtue ethicist, which I have another video on, or a deontologist, which is a rule-based ethicist, right? They can all believe in rights, but they believe in them for different reasons. But the rights framework is basically an approach. It's not so much a grand ethical theory about what makes something right or wrong, good or evil. It's an approach to solving problems, especially political or social problems. It basically says you put on the rights framework glasses and you look at a problem or a case study and you go, okay, which decision violates the least number of rights? I'm going to pick that one. Or maybe it's not that simple. Maybe you put on the glasses, it's which decision upholds the rights of the most people? Which one has the best overall balance of violating the least rights and upholding the most rights? Or maybe there's rights that are super, super important. The right to life is probably more important than the right to privacy, right? So maybe which decision prioritizes the most important rights and violates the least important ones or the less important ones, right? Sometimes it's a lesser of two evils. In politics especially, you're gonna have to violate someone's rights eventually. But maybe we should, when we're forced to do that, we violate the least number of rights, or we try to violate the less important rights, like the right to, the right to free thought, to have any opinion you want, is more important than the right to free speech, in my view. Because your inner beliefs, it's one thing to be told, don't ever say your beliefs again. It's another thing to say, you can't even believe that, right? Like, the beliefs of a person are more sacred than them saying the beliefs, in my opinion. But also, the right to free speech, understood very broadly, of just you can say whatever you want, wherever you want it, is not as important as the right to free speech in certain contexts. Or another way you could put it is, your right to say and express whatever idea you want might be trumped by the right of other people to be safe. So if you are using hate speech that stirs up a violent mob, and they go after somebody or some group of people, your free speech probably wasn't as important. Your right to free speech probably wasn't as important as their right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness or whatever, right? So rights framework prioritizes rights, and basically there's no like tight decision criteria of like add up all the rights violated, add up all the rights upheld, but it's trying to balance like, okay, we got to try to do the best and not violate people's rights if we can, and uphold their rights. Rights also imply responsibilities. There's no real sense of talking about a right to something unless you also say somebody has a responsibility to respect that right. So for instance, it's kind of dumb to talk about a right to life. We modern people, especially in the liberal, I don't mean like Democrat, Republican, liberal, I mean like the liberal philosophical movement, really like the idea of rights. The right to life, the right to freedom, the right to free speech. But in my opinion, it's kind of a contrived way of talking that ancient philosophers and even medieval philosophers didn't really talk a lot about. The right to life really just seems like it's the same thing as saying, well, it's a good thing that I'm alive, and none of you can take that away from me. None of you should take that away from me. You all have the responsibility not to kill me. And in fact, you all have the responsibility to help uphold my life when you can under certain circumstances, right? Saying that somebody has the right to life, it's just, what is a right anyway? I could give you links if you want to read about the history of the concept of rights. They're not universal in all cultures. They are not, even by philosophers who all believe in rights, there's a lot of disagreements about what exactly rights are. Are they real? Are they legal fictions that help us live in a better world? But at the very least, rights imply responsibilities. And you could basically, if you have a right, you can basically say everything you want about rights without actually using the word rights. You can talk about responsibilities. So again, a right to life. Well, I could also just simply talk about responsibilities of people not to murder me and to help save my life when they can. That sort of thing. But the rights framework centralizes rights. Okay. Even though rights are a very complicated thing that I hate to say this, but I really think that talk about rights is just a theoretical mess that we all take for granted now. And it's really complicated. you could read many books and articles about, are rights even real? Or are they just a nice way of talking to help us function as a society? I'm moving on. The justice framework, and I forgot to bold it. It's gonna drive me insane. Justice. Here's another one. Just like the idea of rights, justice is a very broad term that could mean a lot of different things in a lot of different scenarios, but generally it has to do with fairness or proportion. A just punishment is a punishment that fits the crime, right? It's a punishment that is proportional to the crime. A classical example of justice is that justice requires, if somebody does something evil to someone, it requires not only a proportional punishment, but also reparations. So they have to pay back what they took or something equivalent. But basically the idea of the justice framework is that we're putting on glasses or filters that we're going to ignore everything else. We're going to look at justice. We're going to look at fairness. We're going to look at people getting what they deserve. Obviously, if I say deserve, you start getting into the realm of rights again. So rights and justice, these are not completely independent of each other. They can overlap. But the justice framework is basically a methodology, a way of looking at things that says, let's focus on justice. Let's focus on the idea of justice, ignore everything else. If we've got an economic case study or problem, we're going to look, okay, is this a fair distribution of money and wealth in society? If 1% of people have all of the money and 99% of people have almost no money, is that fair? Is that just? I don't think so, but you can make different arguments about that. The justice framework essentially operates on the idea of fairness, but again, the idea of justice is complicated and it requires complex ethical theories and theorization, and so it's hard to nail down a precise definition of justice. Decide what's best, figure out which decision would bring about the most justice or involve no violations of justice, that is, no injustice. Again, the problem is, depending on who you ask, justice means different things. Depending on who you ask, rights mean different things and have a different moral status. It's the same sort of problem. But they're rough methodologies, right? No one is saying that the rights framework or justice framework are fundamental moral theories. They're different methods. Utilitarian and consequentialist frameworks, however, those are more like fundamental moral theories. So moving on. Virtue ethics. I have a separate video on this. But to give you a quick rundown, this is one of the most complicated frameworks, and it kind of is messy. It doesn't give you a nice, easy decision criteria. But basically, virtue ethics says, what really matters is people's moral character, the kind of people we are, and also that we achieve the level of being good people. And we don't just mean good in they don't do anything wrong. We mean good in the sense of physically and spiritually and mentally, I am functioning well. There's different theories about functioning, right? But virtue ethicists all share the idea that there is a basic human nature. Human beings have a certain nature, and there's certain ways of life and ways of developing our character that would make us flourish, would make us physically and mentally healthy and have good lives. And so for the virtue ethicist, for the virtue framework, basically the important things, you put on the virtue ethicist glasses, and the important things to look at is, if I'm trying to decide what to do, what type of person would doing this action make me? Would doing this action corrupt my moral character or improve it? Would it make me more virtuous or more full of vices, right? And in the video, I get into more details about what those are and what that means. The other thing I could ask is not just the effect it has on me, but the effect it has on other people. Do my actions help develop people morally? Or do they make people worse? This is especially relevant for teachers. If my teaching method isn't developing my students' moral character, then I failed as an ethics teacher, right? So I as a teacher, and also I'm a virtue ethicist. I think it's the correct moral framework to have overall. My goal as a teacher is not that you get good grades, but that you develop virtues and you become better people with my help in whatever way I can. Because I ultimately think, and virtue ethicists pretty much all agree with this, being the right kind of person, developing the right virtues and moral character makes you happy, makes you flourish. Human flourishing and moral character are interrelated. A truly good person with good moral character is happy. Now, maybe they're not always happy because they get killed or something, or because the world sucks, even if they're perfect. But at least in a perfect world, a good person is fulfilled and happy. So, when I think about my job, I put on the virtue ethics classes. I think, I don't really care about justice in my grading. I want the grade I give you, it's going to be fair because fairness is a virtue. But more importantly, the grade I give you and the feedback I give you, I'm hoping helps you get better at multiple things. And I might take a slightly different approach to grading your paper than your paper, because you have different needs and I need to get you to grow in different ways, right? Part of my job as a teacher. So in general, a virtue ethics framework tells you to look at those sorts of factors, how it affects your character, how it shapes your character, how it shapes other people's character. Does it help people flourish and realize their full potential, both ourselves and others? And not just that, but there's also the idea of moral exemplars or role models in virtue ethics. So would a truly virtuous person do what I'm about to do? What would Jesus do? Is a classic one, right? Would God want me to do this? Maybe you think you have a very virtuous parent or grandparent. Would my grandfather or grandmother, if they were here, would they do that? And there's a big role for role models in virtue ethics. That's why Christianity and most religions are actually primarily virtue ethics, because they all uphold God or the saints or some deity or deities as role models and say that's the model of virtue we need. That's how we should be. Okay, so those are the major ethical frameworks. Consequentialism as a type of consequentialism, utilitarianism. Then we have rights and justice frameworks. Those are really not theories, they're methods. Then we have virtue ethics, which is another grand ethical theory that basically says, here's what when you're trying to decide on something, when you're trying to decide what to think or feel or care about, think about what type of person you want to be or should you be, and do that. What would make you and other people flourish? Do that. What would Jesus do, right? If you have a role model like that. Oh, it's blank. So let's go back to this. And just summarize real quick. Frameworks. Some frameworks are methods. Some frameworks are grand theories. But basically what they have in common, they're structured ways of figuring out what to decide, what to care about, what to value. And I like the metaphor personally of their filters you put over your mind's eye, that they block out certain things and they emphasize certain other things for you to decide. Frameworks help us choose which decision is best, which values are most important. They do so by giving decision criteria. Again, what do they emphasize and then what do they block out? Utilitarianism emphasizes pleasure and pain, blocks out everything else. Virtue ethics emphasizes your moral character and the idea of being a good human, fully functional, healthy human being inside and out, and it blocks out some other stuff. Rights framework. It accentuates, it emphasizes violating rights and upholding rights and blocks everything else out. The justice framework emphasizes and accentuates the idea of fairness and proportionality and justice and blocks everything else out. Right? These frameworks show us what we should care about and what we should kind of put on the back burner. And the things that they emphasize are how we make our analysis or decision. So let me talk about one final thing. Let's talk about how do you then use ethical frameworks in your writing. And I'll keep it really simple. Again, in a case study, draw out, and the prompts of the papers will ask you for specific things, right? So you'll have guidance. But in general, when you're considering some case study, write down your gut reaction, your moral intuition. Chew it over and think about it for a while. Look at it from different perspectives. Do you still have that intuition? Did the intuition change? Keep track of that. Then ask yourself, what's underlying these moral intuitions? Is there some more fundamental moral principle going on here or value that I have? And then also keep these ethical frameworks in mind and ask, what would these frameworks say about them? If I'm just focusing on rights, how does that affect the decision I think I should make in this case? If I'm just focusing on justice or fairness, what decision should I make? What should I care about in this case? If I'm focusing on developing my or other people's character, what decision should I make in this case, right? That's how you should approach your writing assignments. You should not just say, it's right, it's wrong. Don't assert things. You have to argue. And in ethics, arguing involves drawing out moral intuitions, giving general principles that you think are justified and warranted, and also using these frameworks in this class to show if this framework is true, here's how we should see this situation. Okay? I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, email me. Set up office hours with me. But I hope this helps. The third video on virtue ethics is already up, so go watch that too. Bye.